Hi class, it's Dr. Maxwell DiCarlo. I'm going to share with you a little bit about narrative. My goal here for this little piece of the lecture is to tell you a little bit about narrative therapy, which still falls under the postmodernistic therapies like solution focus. So you'll find a lot of things are very similar. It's just that the techniques are slightly different. So we're going to talk about narrative therapy, and then we're going to watch the video of Stan, because I want to make sure you get to watch that, and just see sort of Dr. Corey's version of narrative therapy. Now, the thing to remember is that narrative therapy has been adopted and adapted many different ways. One of the ways that we use this, particularly that I've used this, is in end-of-life care. When you're working with someone who is approaching their end of their life, there's a version of narrative therapy called dignity therapy. And that basically is that you sit with that person and you almost create a memory book where you have certain prompts that you use of what are you most proud of? What is your biggest regret? What things have you accomplished in your life? What characteristics would people remember about you? And you create pages, and sometimes you put pictures and things like that, where they make a memory book of their life. And it's very therapeutic for the patient, the client, and you work with them to create this memory book. And then once that person dies, you actually give that to the family, which is also very therapeutic in their grieving process. So narrative therapy has been sort of adapted for multiple different populations. Interestingly enough, some of the populations, and we'll talk a little bit about this, that you would think maybe would not be most appropriate for narrative therapy, it's being tested out with and getting some pretty good results. So I think this is probably one of those theoretical approaches that we're going to see more and more about as we proceed through more research in the literature. So the basic underpinnings are the same as solution-focused brief narrative. Solution-focused brief therapy, in that it's still the idea of this social constructivism, is that there's no object reality. The client is constructing their own reality. Reality is really based on their interface with society and their environment and how they define themselves as they are interfacing with their environment. The interesting piece of that then is that in narrative therapy, we are analyzing how people are defining who they are and how they are approaching situations in their behavior. And then we're looking at sort of the voices that inform them of who they are and how they should behave. And then we're choosing after they analyze that, choosing, does that really work for me? Is that who I really want to be? And if so, great. And if not, then how can I change that and maybe tap into a different voice, if you will, in order to be more authentic and rewrite my story the way that I want it to read. So this very much is used, it's narrative therapy. We're writing a story. We're looking at the story of who someone is and then using this sort of symbolism to help them be able to write a new chapter, to explore, take on different qualities and maybe rewrite their character and who they are. Okay. It also is very much based in existentialism, right? That every person is unique. Again, there's no object reality. There's no right or wrong way of doing things necessarily, but that we have choices in what paths we choose to take, and that there are always options on how we can rewrite and adapt the story to be what we want it to be. Narrative therapy is very focused on social inequalities. So there is an awareness in this theory that there are certain things in our society or in our environment that are realistic, very realistic for us, and they play a part, or even if one would say a character, in the in our story. So what that means is that there are very realistic social inequalities. There's power and oppression. There's empowerment. There's glass ceilings. There's all of those things are very real. And they all, if you will, kind of like in an allegory, they take on a character in our own narrative and our own life story and how they impact who we are and how we are writing our story. The basic assumption is that people live their lives according to the stories that they're participating in. So we basically take on a character in our story, and we live according to how we would define that character. Everything is within the social context. So this is not about an internal process. Everything, the problems are all very externalized. This isn't about a character development. Well, now that could be taken differently. It's not about an internal personality development, that there was a task or a phase that wasn't completed appropriately. It is about our interface with our society and surroundings. With that, there is an underlying understanding that surveillance, looking around and seeing sort of how we fit in and how we are alike or similar or different from others, and scrutinizing those differences is a social norm. We all do it. Everyone does it. We do it to each other. We do it with ourselves. And it is part of kind of our story. And it's worth us looking at, is there a voice in our story that is really sort of stimulated by not living up to or not finding worth in our character and the part that we are playing in that in that story. The next piece here is that there is an alternative to any story. This kind of goes back to when we were talking about reality therapy, that there's always a choice that we can make. And in existential therapy, when we're talking about that we have the freedom and responsibility to make different choices should we deem that necessary. So narrative therapy really borrows from that and says, hey, there's always an alternate story. This is a really interesting concept because when clients are coming into us and talking with us, they're telling us a story. They're highlighting the elements that seem important to them about the story. And part of what we do in therapy is sort of dig beyond just what they're presenting to us to see and understand the untold stories and draw those out, because there could be another perspective. You know, one of the things that comes to mind just to kind of like highlight this whole concept is that, I don't know if any of you have ever seen the movie Maleficent, right? It's about Sleeping Beauty, but it's about the Wicked Witch. And the whole story is about like her actual story of how she became who she was, and it's a play off of Sleeping Beauty, right? Is it Sleeping Beauty or Snow White? Whatever, you know what I mean. But that's what we're really doing is that we're digging deeper to see if there are some kind of stories that are not being highlighted, that the client is not necessarily bringing to our attention when they're recalling situations or events, but rather there is an untold story that we could dig deeper to gain, in some ways, that same psychological flexibility to be able to see the story from a different perspective and then possibly be able to rewrite that story to be in more alignment with where we really want to go and what our goals are. So interestingly enough, one of the areas of research that narrative therapy has been used with is working with people with body dysmorphic disorders. So oftentimes we see this with folks who play sports, particularly women who have have played sports. And as they've played sports like this, the society's image of what is beauty, right, is one thing, right? And oftentimes, women who are more athletic don't fall into those categories of what would be deemed by American culture as beauty. So when we look at body dysmorphic disorders, oftentimes we're seeing folks who are coming in because there's a disconnect between sort of the story that they are writing and the images that society is giving them. The dominant voice is telling them what beauty looks like. And so what we do is we explore what beauty looks like, what is society's dominant voice about what beauty is really the only voice that is speaking, or are there other pieces that we could look at? And folks will rewrite their story. They'll analyze where those voices are coming from, sort of key into maybe the oppressed voice of what beauty is, and then choose to write that into their story. And then oftentimes what they do is they actually will write out their story and then present it to people who are supportive of them as they're becoming this new version of themselves. So another assumption is that social limitations are very real. We already kind of talked about that. That we can't ignore things like discrimination and oppression and prejudice. Those are parts of the story. Now we can write the story to try to limit or find a way around those other characters in the story, but we can't eliminate them. And we have to be mindful that they are a very real part of many of our stories. What we do work towards is trying to disarm them, find a way around, or use that character to be able to in some way be able to write the story of minimizing that character. Not that it's not there, but that it is only one character in a very large novel of our lives. We already talked about there's always stories that are not part of the dominant story, the untold stories that are under the surface, and that's what we're really going for. The other piece of this, just like in solution-focused brief therapy, is that problems are always externalized. And here's the element of narrative therapy that is very interesting, is that in narrative therapy, we don't adhere to the fact that people are their diagnosis, but rather that they have accepted the symptoms that they have and what those mean, the definition of those symptoms, and they have accepted those and have written those into their story. So, you know, the person who comes in and is struggles with insomnia, they have integrated the definition of insomnia into the being of who they are. And what we are then trying to do is create that distance, that disconnect between the two, so that they can externalize the problem and see that insomnia is something that they have written into their story, but that they can write out of their story and eliminate if they so choose. Now, some of you may really have an issue with that, right? But this is, again, if that philosophy doesn't work for you and doesn't seem like it would be productive, then maybe this theory isn't the best choice for you. For many people, taking that externalized perspective of symptoms actually does work and helps them sort of remove themselves from that, be able to redefine who they are, and in that process, they're able to then disengage from some of those symptoms. So again, not for everyone, but can work. So the techniques that we really use is that we have people write out a personal narrative, okay? So they actually do a personal narrative. So things that come to mind is, what if someone isn't good at writing or they don't like writing? They don't necessarily have to write it out in a novel form. Oftentimes people do, will write chapters of their life, but we can use this with children where they can do pictures and draw pictures of their life at different stages in their life. So this is really done with the individual, the client, sort of telling us their life story, telling us about different phases in their life. And that's really where we start doing our assessment. We start looking for dominant voices that are guiding and defining who they are, right? So this could be parents, or this could be social groups or peer groups, or this could be their church, or this could be, like, all of those things are very real voices in the midst of people's stories. And then the next piece of this is that we start deconstructing the story and really looking at exploring assumptions about the way things are, where the problem is, the reality of problems. And here's where we've got that big S word again, the shoulds, right? Oftentimes what we hear in people's stories is, I should have made a different decision, or I should have known, or I should have, right? All of those shoulds that just sort of beat us up. And we look at where those came from. Where in people's story are they in this place of just shoulding themselves to death for how they behaved or how they wrote their story, those kinds of things. And then we look at how this incongruence between what they should have done and the client's true self, how that's creating this dissonance, which really is like the ground for fostering the problems that are being created in their person, in their life. So looking at expectations and where there's a disconnect between what they should have, could have done and what they did, and helping them resolve that dissonance. And that's what we really do. And we talk to them about, okay, so how would you rewrite this? What could you do now to go back and resolve that? And then once we do that, we move into the reconstruction. And this is really where we start talking about, how could you re-author your story? If you're getting the picture that this is very much about sort of redefining who we are and how we interact with society and what we want to be and move towards our goals of our idealized self, it is. That's really what this is very much about. So we look at the dominant voices that are sort of outside of the client, that are dictating the client's behavior, okay? And then we try to pull out maybe the oppressed voice that is more realistic for who the true self of the client is. And we try to pull that out and see how they would respond in situations based on that oppressed voice, as opposed to the dominant voice that they might be allowing to define who they are in their behavior. Okay. One of my favorite things in narrative therapy is this idea of sparkling moments. These are when there are those moments that we responded in situations, or we acted in certain situations, and it felt so authentic for us. It was the moment where we went against the grain and the dominant voice that was telling us who we are, and we really believed that we are who our true self was. Okay. These are like, have you ever had those moments where you felt so alive because you were engaging in an activity that just felt so very genuine for you? That's what narrative therapy would call sparkling moments. And that's what our goal is to help clients be mindful, aware of those sparkling moments, and create more sparkling moments, okay, where they were able to rise above the voices, the oppressed voices that were dictating who they were, and find that level of authenticity to find their own personal truth and strength. Okay, sparkling moments. Who wouldn't want that, right? Okay, so the goal of therapy is to awaken the client from problematic patterns of living. Again, it's not a pathological, we don't, of course we have to diagnose, but the focus is not on pathology, but rather that everyone experiences problems in living, patterns of problematic behavior in living. Our goal is to liberate the client from externally imposed constraints and definitions of who they are so that they can define themselves without the problem. So oftentimes what we will do is we will really map the influence of the problem. Like, when did this start? How has it impacted your life? Have there been times, sparkling moments, when it has been less impacting in your life? And then we help the client be able to re-author their stories. And in those re-authored stories, we're focusing in on the fact that they are competent to make change, to add characters, to change characters, particularly themselves, and incorporate those into our new stories. And then the next piece is that we want to incorporate social supports. If this whole theoretical perspective is based on the fact that there is an interface between society and ourselves, then it's important then to increase the interaction between positive social support so that they can witness the becoming of the character that the client is working towards. Okay, so oftentimes at the conclusion of therapy, there's like a celebration where the client will invite people who they believe would be supportive of them to come and hear the client's new story and how they are creating themselves. Okay, so just so that you have this information, sort of the steps in narrative therapy is, first, what you're going to do is you're going to name the problem. We're going to look at it as if they're characters, right? Then you're going to explore how the problem has dominated So we're going to explore how the problem has dominated the client's life or disrupted the progression of their life story. Then we're going to invite the client to view the story differently, all things we've already talked about, right? Pulling out the untold stories, looking at historic events and helping them be able to see their competence and that they are capable, right, to escape sort of that dominant voice that is telling them all those shoulds and see the untold stories that might have been in those situations, the exceptions that might be there that maybe they're not keying into as part of the details of the story. Then we turn our attention to the future and how the story is going to unfold. And this is the really empowering piece, is that we are empowering clients to be able to say, hey, you know what, I want to change this behavior. I don't want this to be part of my story anymore. So I'm going to make this change and I'm going to rewrite this story. And then there's that celebratory element that I already talked about when we bring in positive social supports to reinforce that the client is making these changes and to bring other people alongside them to support them in the changes that they're making. So who really benefits from narrative therapy? This is really an interesting one, is that trauma survivors, the research shows that trauma survivors really benefit from this. Those who are struggling with oppression or identity issues, where's my place in the world, how do I fit in, how do I deal with discrimination and oppression and things like that. Stigmatized populations, this is very powerful because of the element of empowerment. Is very powerful for those individuals. Also, people who are facing transitions, right? We all have transitions in life, and how am I going to write this story? How am I going to approach things differently now with this new start that I have? Those populations, this works really well with. And also folks who are sort of dealing with low self-esteem, who need to sort of rewrite how they view themselves and how they interact with the world. And people who are struggling with expectations, right? I've used this with stay-at-home moms who are kind of struggling with what their role right? Hate the S word, should be in family, and who they are and their overarching goals for their life and what that looks like. And so this can be very powerful for that population because they're sort of figuring out what their identity is going to be, how they're going to balance their values in their story and what that's going to look like. On the flip side of this, there are certain populations that narrative therapy might not be the very best approach with. And that is, sometimes individuals come in and they have one specific thing that they might be needing, right? They've had one situation that happened and they need some like concrete resources to help them. They need medication and then they're on their way. So sometimes for that population, maybe not the best. The other thing is that when someone's in crisis and they're coming in and they need their mood stabilized, they're coming in and they're suicidal or they're having extreme mood swings and things like that, you have to get them stable before you would try an approach like this, because this is really kind of shaking things up and helping them like reauthor themselves. You're not going to do that in the middle of a crisis situation. So stabilization first before we'd ever think about using this type of therapeutic approach. I have in here clients for which social worker cannot provide unbiased treatment, social worker or counselor. So in this approach, oftentimes there is just an added element that the counselor needs to be aware of, is that we're not rewriting the client's story. We are helping them find the story that is truth and appropriate for them. So if we are jumping in and the story that the client wants to write is not something that is within our value system for them to write, then we need to check ourselves, right? Because we may not be able to provide unbiased care and unbiased opinion as they're writing their story, right? i.e., if you work with a client who is questioning their identity, their sexual identity, and they, as they are writing their story, they're coming out of the closet to say that they are going to engage in homosexual relationships, and that's who their true self is. If that's part of their story that they're trying to rewrite and we are not comfortable or not able to support them in that story, then we need to really keep ourselves in check, because again, this is their story to write and they get to take responsibility. Remember, responsibility and freedom, they get to make those choices. And if we cannot be a bystander to help them along in their story, then we need to be aware of that and just make sure that we're not imposing on them values or not allowing them to write their story the way that is true and authentic for them. This also may not be the best choice for folks who we can't ground in reality, right? Because we are writing the story, they're writing their story, but if there is an issue with their ability to sort of grasp reality and what it is, i.e. folks who are having an active psychotic disorder or psychotic episodes, probably not the best approach. Although there has been more and more research for using this with folks who struggle with schizophrenia and things like that, where they do have some psychotic elements to that. So that is just, it's not to say that there's no place for using narrative therapy. It might just not be researched adequately at this point. Okay, so that rounds out our discussion of narrative therapy. I want to play the video so that you can see um, the video of Stan and Dr. Corey using this approach. So I'm going to play this. Hang on, going to make it bigger. There it is. Okay.
This session, you'll be seeing narrative therapy with Stan, and we'll assume that he's had 9 sessions. And we're going to primarily be looking at how Stan can rewrite his life story, how the way he's been living his life so far doesn't mean he has to continue living this way in the future. You know, we've been together for quite a few sessions now, Stan. We've been talking a lot about a term I use, problem-saturated stories. Sometimes you've really got into a story that's just laden with problems. And, you know, I've asked you to kind of see how you're not necessarily just a problem, that, you know, problems don't always get the best of you. And, you know, I think what I want to do more in this session is talk about a different kind of story. We've been doing some of that, but if you can almost think of how you would like to rewrite your life story. We've talked quite a bit in past sessions about the way your story has been.
I'm not really sure kind of how to do that.
Yeah, I know. Well, I have an idea.
Okay.
You know, books need to be revised often. And I have a thought. What if I asked you to kind of think of your life as a book, and we're going to revise it? At least you'll revise it. And I'll ask you to come up with a different, let's say, chapter title.
Yeah. Nothing really. I don't know. Doesn't really.
Well, how about
really coming up with anything?
Okay, how about the title of your book? If you had to give your life a title so far, what would your title of the book say?
Yeah, I don't know. It doesn't really. I'm just blanking for whatever reason. It just doesn't really kind of connect with me. I don't know.
So maybe this is a stretch to ask you to think about.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't really think in those terms.
You don't? So you don't think in terms of book revisions?
No.
As it applies to your life. We've talked some about you being in construction, so maybe we can use that kind of metaphor. You told me you've remodeled houses.
Yeah.
Okay. Is that any different than building a house from scratch?
Yeah, it's a lot different. I mean, to remodel a house, you don't tear the whole house down to remodel it. You keep, you know, a lot of the structures there. You just kind of change things around a little bit.
Okay. Well,
make things better. You fix what's might not be broken, or fix what might be broken.
Okay. Well, how about using that for a time? How about if you're going to remodel?
Yeah, I could try that.
Yeah, you could remodel your life.
Okay.
What would you want to remodel? What rooms would you want to change?
Oh, I see. Okay. Well, I mean, I think I've already started on some of the stuff, but I think about the floor, the foundation, like, you know, having a firmer foundation to stand on would be good.
Yeah. So the foundation would be firmer.
Yeah.
And the floor would
feel a little more solid. Yeah.
More solid, more support. Right. What other rooms would you want to change?
Well, I think maybe fix the roof a bit. Fix the roof a bit. Got some leaks up here, I think.
Leaks?
Occasionally, yeah. Some bad stuff leaks in. I'd like to kind of maybe shore that up a bit.
Okay. So what would that roof look like if you were to have remodeled it?
It would just be nothing fancy. It would just be, you know, functional. Like it would give me, when the storms come, I'm not going to get wet.
Okay. So it served its purpose.
Yeah, exactly.
Uh-huh.
And I could count on it. I wouldn't be worried about where the next leak was going to come.
Right. Any other parts of your house that you'd want to restructure?
I want to say the plumbing, but I won't. Maybe could use a little paint job, maybe.
Mm-hmm.
Kind of make it look a little newer, a little more taken care of.
Mm-hmm. And how would that fit for your life?
Well, I think I'm starting to do some exercise, and I think coming here helps that too. Kind of looking at myself and seeing, things I can do to succeed.
Right. Now, when you work on a house, in a remodeling job, do you actually have a plan before you go in?
Generally, yes. So you have a pretty good plan of what you want to do and how you're going to do it.
And you have some drawings, and you know how it would like
Right.
it to look.
Yeah, want to find out how much it's going to cost to get all the materials together and have them all there, so you're not running back and forth all the time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Doing double work.
I wonder if you could apply that to your life too. Having a plan for how you'd like to have a different life story.
Yeah, that sounds good.
Mm-hmm.
I haven't started that, but I kind of have some ideas.
Well, maybe just say a few things about some things you'd like to change about your life story.
Well, I think one of the key things is I want to kind of close things out with my ex-wife.
Mm-hmm.
And be able to feel good about where I stand with her and where we are. Even though we're divorced and we're not going to get back together, I would still like to be able to feel good about where we stand with each other.
Mm-hmm.
And I think maybe talking with her about some of the stuff I'm learning here with you would help.
Okay. That's an important one.
Yeah.
Another one?
Feeling generally more confident, especially in school and with women, asking women out, being able to be okay if they say no and not be crushed by it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And are there any other ways you'd like to alter your life story? Like if you
like to have a better relationship with my parents.
Okay.
I don't know how that one's going to work out, but it would be nice to be able to go to Thanksgiving dinner and not feel under the gun.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So we can go on with this more. But I'm wondering now, even in the sessions we've had, have you made any of those changes in having a different kind of life than you had when you started?
Yes.
You have.
I think especially around the confidence area. I mean, I feel even talking to you now, when I first started, I feel like I can kind of speak openly and I have to worry so much about what you're going to think or how it's going to turn out.
Right. Sometimes I think it helps to have an audience out there that can support us, particularly to get a life story to take root, a new life story. Who in your life out there could support you? Who would be least surprised by your changes?
Well, I think the person who would be the least surprised is I had a high school math teacher who really, for whatever reason, really encouraged me to go to school and thought that I could do well. I don't think that she would be too surprised that I'm moving in that direction now.
Yeah. So maybe you could think more of what you want to tell her and have conversations with her about your changes. What do you think she would say to you about the changes in your life?
I think she would just keep encouraging me to tell me, good job, keep going, don't stop.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So it's possible to rewrite your life story in some ways. So I hope you will give a more thought to that, about particularly the notion that you could redesign your life and your future much like you remodel a house. You know, I'd like to give you a piece of feedback, Stan. I suggested an exercise of thinking about your life as a book and revising the book, revising your life, and somehow it didn't fit for you.
Sorry about that. I tried. That just didn't work. Yeah.
But that wasn't a problem with you. Maybe it was just more my exercise didn't fit. What I liked about that is that you didn't just try to go along with it and please me. You said, this doesn't seem to fit, which is new. That's different. And you didn't take the blame for it. You didn't say, well, I'm not a good client because I didn't go along with your exercise.
Huh. Yeah, I didn't think about that.
Yeah. Well, those are important differences that I'm noticing. So I'll be looking forward to seeing those blueprints.
Okay.
Okay, so, sorry, I was just looking at that. Okay, so the thing I really like about this is that it really shows how you can adapt this idea of narrative therapy to work for the client, right? So it didn't really work for him to necessarily tap into the idea of writing a book and writing his life story, but construction worked for him because that made sense to him. And so Dr. Corey adjusted it to show, to do the exact same thing, but really adapt it to the client for what made sense for him. I love how he was then able to sort of symbolically identify the kinds of changes that he would want to make so that he could be the house that he would, the remodel that he would want. So I think this is a pretty good adaptation of how one could use narrative therapy techniques. It didn't necessarily get into sort of the oppressive voices and things like that, although from the sessions that we've seen from Stan thus far, you probably would be able to hypothesize that some of the oppressive voices that he's experienced and have been dominant in his story are that of his dad and never being good enough and that kind of thing. And where are the exceptions, where his sparkling moments would be something that we would continue to sort of explore if you were using this theoretical model. Okay. There you have it. There's narrative therapy. The book does a real good job of explaining this as well, so be sure to look in your workbook. Again, there's a lot of similarities. These are kind of labeled as postmodernistic approaches. They get kind of grouped together. If you have any questions, please don't hesitate to reach out to me. Also, just as a reminder, all papers, including the final project, are due by Monday at 11:59. So whatever's in the drop boxes by 11:59, I will grade. Anything that comes in after that, unfortunately, I will not. So be sure that you get that in as we're approaching the end of the course here. Be sure that you complete that end of course survey. We really want, I personally really want your feedback on what worked for you and what maybe didn't. And also, particularly because this is a pilot project, we want to really get feedback as to whether or not this is something worthwhile that we should continue doing. So, okay, I will keep working on getting week 6 stuff closed out here shortly, and then double back to things that have been submitted late. All right, take care. Let me know if you need anything. Bye-bye.